Good evening, and welcome to Boston College. My name is Melinda Brown Donovan. I'm Associate Director of Continuing Education for the School of Theology and Ministry. I'm delighted to welcome all of you this evening. As a matter of fact, we had 98 people register for this, but the very nice weather, I think, has kept them out of our room here. This seems to happen every spring, but we're glad you're here. This is the last presentation for this academic year of our themed lectures around the theme of hope for healing. And this evening, we will be presenting the final and very foundational component of that theme with the presentation, Healing Through Pastoral Care. It's now my honor to introduce our presenter, Melissa Kelley. In fact, it's the second time in 12 days that I've had the privilege of introducing her. So she does a great deal for us here. Melissa started her career teaching high school English and French for 7 years, realizing that she most enjoyed the one-on-one connections with students. She pursued a master's degree from the Boston College Institute for Religious Education and Pastoral Ministry. This degree led her to 14 years as a campus minister at both Emmanuel College and Boston College. After completing her PhD in pastoral psychology from Boston University, she served on the faculty of Weston Jesuit School of Theology in Cambridge. Melissa now serves as Associate Professor of Pastoral Care and Counseling and Contextual Education at the School of Theology and Ministry. Her courses include Death and Dying, Grief and Loss, and Grief and the Bible, a course which she co-teaches with a member of the Old Testament faculty. Melissa is a fellow and nationally certified pastoral counselor through the American Association of Pastoral Counselors. She's also certified in thanatology, death, dying, and bereavement through the Association for Death Education and Counseling, the primary organization in the country for bereavement researchers, educators, and clinicians. She is the author of Grief, Contemporary Theory and the Practice of Ministry, published in 2010 by Augsburg Fortress Press. Please join me in welcoming Melissa Kelley.
Thank you, Melinda, and thank you all for being here this evening. I do know when the nice weather beckons, it's very hard to kind of commit to anything, so I appreciate your being here. It's always wonderful, too, when we do an event like this. I always see folks that I know, and it's just wonderful to see so many of you that I have known, in some cases, for years. And, you know, as some of you started coming in the door the last half hour or so, I was just thinking to myself, you know, I don't know the specifics of what really most of you do. Many of you I have not yet met. I don't know the specifics of what you do, but I know, you know, everyone is out there doing their best to do good work in the world. That's what draws you to an evening like this. That's what draws you to reflect on the topics of healing and pastoral care. And even without knowing the specifics, I'm moved by knowing what this room represents, what all of you represent. And I want to thank you for that. In ministry settings and in schools of ministry such as this, we talk about pastoral care all the time. Not always with a whole lot of specificity. It's one of those words or phrases like community that we tend to use and don't always know exactly how we're using it or if others understand how we're meaning it. Pastoral care is also frequently described as a ministry of healing. Well, healing is another one of those words. What precisely does that mean? To call pastoral care a ministry of healing, how do we understand that, and how do we understand how such healing might actually occur? So tonight what I would like to do is offer some thoughts that invite us to look at that that phrase, pastoral care as a ministry of healing. Some of what I offer will no doubt be familiar to us from years of study, from your practice. I'm also going to offer some newer ways that some folks are talking about pastoral care today. First, though, I think it's helpful to clarify some of the terms that we're using. So pastoral, we know, derives from the Middle English and then the Latin pastoralis, meaning the shepherd, the pastor, the herdsman. And so for the Christian, the ultimate model of pastoral care, of course, is the Good Shepherd. What do we mean by pastoral care? This is a definition that I find very helpful and very moving to me. This is by Jean Stevenson Musner, who says pastoral care is an outreach of compassion, often accompanied by an action of care. The compassion comes first. It's grounded in compassion. And then often, but perhaps not always, there's some sort of action that attaches to it. And she says the action might be as ordinary as offering food to someone who's isolated and lonely, or as complicated as intervening in a medical crisis. Whatever the form of care, this outreach of compassion is grounded in a faith community. It's done as part of or on behalf of a faith community. Who offers pastoral care? Well, of course we know, like probably many of you in the room, we often think of it as the work of the religious leader, the priest, the lay ecclesial minister. And of course, this is an essential part of all of those roles. But it's not restricted to them, of course. Pastoral care is also often the work of all the faithful. So I'm sure many of you are in parishes or faith communities where there are lay visitation programs or bereavement support groups. That's an important part of pastoral care, usually done with some training. What we are all doing in pastoral care is being present to one another at the important times of life and sometimes the ordinary moments of life. So, of course, pastoral care is called for in times of joy and celebration. You know, we're on hand for baptisms and weddings, etc. But often, as we know, it's needed when folks are really struggling and suffering, when they've experienced sadness or crisis or loss or transition, or they're making important decisions, or relationships are faltering or ending, etc. This is where healing may be especially needed. So this will be my primary focus tonight, those moments that call for healing. And clearly at such times, we do want to begin with compassion. That is the essence of what people need and what we're called to offer. And to me, this slide has one of the most beautiful expressions of that compassion that I've ever seen as a description of pastoral care. Milton Vahey is a pastor, and he describes his own mentor as someone who cast the bread of gentle compassion upon the troubled waters of other people's lives. I just think that's beautiful. It says it all, really, to cast the bread of gentle compassion upon the troubled waters of other people's lives. So with this understanding as sort of a little bit of a linguistic framework, what I would like to do now is invite us to think about healing. What do we mean when we say healing? And I have one visual aid tonight. It's a box of Band-Aids. Now, I'm not going to do what you might expect, like, oh, yes, you know, we put bandages on people's deep spiritual wounds. No, I'm going to do something different. I don't know if you all buy Band-Aid brand bandages, but a couple of weeks ago, I was brushing my teeth or something, and I was just kind of looking around for something to read, and I noticed, I looked down on the top of this box of Band-Aids, and lo and behold, do you know what the slogan is? You're going to be just fine. And there's an exclamation point. Could there be a more reassuring slogan for a Band-Aid company? You're going to be just fine. Exclamation point. Now, I don't know about you, but as I looked down at that, I thought, that's rather presumptuous of Band-Aid brand bandages. How do they know I'm going to be just fine? What do they know about my reason for needing these? And why the exclamation point? Well, of course, I think it no doubt reflects this desire we all have to believe that about ourselves, about those we care about, those we worry about. Everything's going to be just fine. So it's actually probably quite a clever motto, slogan for a bandage company. I'll pass it around so you can see it firsthand. And if you have need, there are actually bandages inside. So this actually may be exactly how some of us would think about healing, at least in some settings. Returning someone to a state of being just fine, or normal, or regaining health, or cure. Those are some of the ways we would probably think of healing, is at least physical healing. And in fact, those are some of the definitions we could find in the dictionary. These are some of the ones that I found. Healing is to restore to health or soundness, to set right, to repair, to restore a person to spiritual wholeness. So my question for us is this the goal, the work, the promise of pastoral care? To assure people that they will be cured, restored to wholeness, or just fine, exclamation point. That exclamation point just makes me laugh, as if it needed extra emphasis. Well, perhaps in some sense this is the work of pastoral care, but we clearly want to dig into that more. And so to help us dig into that, I'm going to look at healing through pastoral care first by talking about the what of it, the where of it, the when of it, and the how of it. So first, what might pastoral care heal? Well, we know, and I'm sure you all know from your work, that in times of loss or suffering or crisis, many people describe that experience as something like brokenness. And sometimes people actually use those words. Things feel broken. After a relationship ends, people might say, I've had my heart broken again. Or, my dreams have been shattered, broken. Or the stories, the future, someone thought was laid out in front of them, gone. It's all in pieces. These are words that I frequently hear people use at a time of loss. Everything is in pieces, shattered, fragmented, broken, destroyed. What can also be broken are one's images of oneself or others or even of God. So for instance, we all know C.S. Lewis, the wonderful author and theologian who wrote A Grief Observed after the death of his wife, Joy, his beloved wife, Joy. And this is one thing he said about his image of God. Not that I am, I think, in much danger of ceasing to believe in God. The real danger is of coming to believe such dreadful things about him. The conclusion I dread is not, so there's no God after all, but so this is what God is really like. Deceive yourself no longer. For C.S. Lewis, it was a journey of figuring out what to do with a broken image of God. And so for many folks, an experience of loss or crisis can also lead to broken faith. The faith that had sustained them up until then, in which they had put all their hopes, it isn't working, isn't holding. It's broken. So that's a bit of the what of pastoral care? What might pastoral care heal? Now, what about where? This is one area where newer work is challenging some of the more traditional understandings of pastoral care. Many of us who went to school or studied pastoral care 20, 15, even 10 years ago, we were probably focused primarily on one-on-one care. Would that be true of many of you? What to say to the one individual who comes to you for help, or what to say to the one person in the hospital bed who's in crisis, or what to say to the one student whose family is falling apart. What we are realizing more and more is that pastoral care is bigger than, needs to be bigger than simply one-on-one care. We need to think systemically and structurally. That often the entity in need of care is a whole community, or a whole family, or a whole system, or a whole organization. That doesn't mean the individuals don't also need the care, but it's bigger than individuals, often. And we are being challenged to think globally more and more about pastoral care. As we become a global village, what affects one person on one side of the world in a very real way affects all of us. And so pastoral care needs to move out of whatever sort of parochial limitations we might have once had, and at least cognitively understand that this connects with what is happening throughout the world. And it also connects to the natural world. Now, a word about when might pastoral care heal. Obviously, we know that after the fact, after there's been a significant event, there's a need for pastoral care. And that's probably where most of us do most of our work, after the fact. But more and more, I think, we need to challenge ourselves in terms of how can we anticipate and even stave off suffering in the first place. And I'd like to illustrate that point with two different experiences that I find incredibly painful, that I think we have not yet done enough as a community of faith to address. The first is what I call the grief born of injustice, and the second is domestic violence. And my point in bringing this to us as part of this presentation is to help us just to recall that comfort after the fact may be of poor consolation to someone whose grief or suffering never needed to happen. And so part of our offering pastoral care may actually be to work ahead of time on the front lines to prevent certain sorts of suffering. It's a different way of thinking about pastoral care. So what I mean by the grief born of injustice is grief that is due in whole or in part to injustice, perhaps because it's caused by unjust actions or inactions of others or of groups. It's grief that's not part of the natural order of things. You know, for instance, when my wonderful grandmother, who I still miss, died at 104 a couple of years ago, that was part of the natural order of things. There was absolutely no shock or no regret that she had not lived her life fully. But we know that that's not always the case. Some grief occurs that never needed to happen. It was preventable. And I'm sure you can think of a million examples, and you probably work with folks who have experienced the grief born of injustice. But let me give you what to me is always just the most horrifying example, which is people dying of starvation. And we know that 1.2 billion people live on $1 a day or less in our world. And then if you look at that third bullet down, this is the kicker for me. While worldwide food production is sufficient for feeding the world's population, someone dies of starvation every 3.6 seconds. How can that be, right? And we know this statistic, but how can that be? Where there is enough food. So to me, this is the ultimate example of the grief born of injustice. that all of those grieving parents whose children die of starvation or die of unsanitary conditions or lack of access to clean water, all of that grief was preventable. So, another painful example is domestic violence. We know these statistics probably pretty well too, that in this country, 85% of the victims of domestic violence are women. And if we think just about women for a moment, 1 in 4 will experience domestic violence in her lifetime. So if we just look at ourselves in this room, and we just crunch the numbers, many of us in this room are going to be affected by domestic violence, or already have. Every time we stand before a faith community, I just assume now that there's a large percentage of folks who've been touched by domestic violence. Now, the good news is the U.S. bishops have actually produced wonderful materials speaking out about domestic violence with sample homilies, etc. The bad news is a lot of people don't seem to know about that. And I have to say, every year when I teach anything, I try to bring domestic violence into just about every course I teach because I just think it's such a horrible crisis. And every year I have to say, and it kills me to have to say it, but I always have to say to the students, I have yet to hear a homily or a reflection on domestic violence in a faith community. Now that doesn't mean, of course, they're being given. I'm just not there. But in the places where I go, I have yet to hear it. Never, 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 never have I heard anyone speak out about domestic violence. So when we talk about pastoral care and comfort and compassion and the action of care, what is it we need to do, we must do, we can do on the front lines ahead of time to avoid having to offer pastoral care to folks who've been victimized in these ways? So we can think of this, what I would call it, is prophetic pastoral care. They're not, there was a day, I think, when we used to think, some of us are called to prophetic ministry, some of us are called to pastoral care ministry, and they're really very separate. Well, of course we know that's not true. It's all of a piece. Again, how does one offer pastoral care to someone whose grief or suffering was preventable? So I would like to propose that when pastoral care happens is sometimes ahead of time, anticipating, working for justice, structural change as part of care of others, healing ahead of time in a way. So now what I'd like to do is turn to the question of how pastoral care might heal. After the what, the when, and the where, how? How does it actually happen? Now, this is a tough one, right? How does one put healing in a formula? Well, I can't. The best I can do is offer you 3 perspectives that I have come to find very, very helpful, valuable, that resonate with a lot of folks, either who have felt that these were helpful to them, or folks who in their own caregiving, find that these are effective and helpful. I have found these very helpful in my own work. The common denominator among these 3 perspectives is relationship. And we know from a lot of research in therapy and counseling, if you ask folks if they have found their therapy helpful or healing, among those folks who say yes, and then you say, well, what was it? Was it the technique? Was it the method? What was it? The vast majority of folks will say it was the relationship with the therapist, no matter what the therapist's method was. Now that's interesting because it sort of encourages people to move in psychology, to move beyond some of the wars about the best methods. I mean, methods matter, but what we are learning over and over and over and over and over again is that most people will say what was most healing was the relationship. They felt the care, they felt the compassion, they felt the trustworthiness of the other. So the first perspective I would like to offer you is coming out of this idea of brokenness that we mentioned a few slides ago, that for many people an experience of suffering or crisis can feel like brokenness. And so the first perspective on how pastoral care can heal is that the pastoral caregiver, whether it's an individual caregiver or the community, can create what can feel like a holding environment for the person who feels broken. Now, if you have ever broken anything that you've loved and it shattered into pieces, what's the first thing you often want to do? You get those pieces together, right? You don't want them being kicked under the table or something, or stepped on and crushed. And we guard them. We save them until we figure out what to do. In our experiences of brokenness, we often need, want, must feel held. Somebody has to help us feel like the pieces are going to be held. Now, that can sound kind of simple, but I want to say to you, don't ever underestimate the power of that. I have heard from so many folks in grieving over the years that what was most helpful to them, sometimes people worry about what to say. I don't know what to say. This is such a tragedy or a crisis. I don't know what to say. And what most folks say is, or at least what they've shared with me is, I don't even remember what people said. I remember who showed up. I remember who helped me to feel like there was a safety net under me. That language of safety net is another metaphor for holding. That's what we remember. When we show up at our worshiping community on Sundays or Saturdays, we're probably not thinking to ourselves, I am now doing my part to hold the brokenness of this community. But we are. That's exactly what we're doing. If we weren't there, the safety net's a little less taut, a little less full. And a lot of people rely on that feeling of being held by the community in their brokenness. And it is through that feeling of being held that many people can at least begin to feel or understand what we talk about when we say, oh, God holds us in our brokenness. God is always holding us. Sometimes people don't really know what that means because it's never been their experience. But if we have a human experience of it, a communal experience of it, sometimes it can become easier to at least imagine a divine experience of it. The second perspective I'd like to offer draws on the work of Merle Jordan, who I consider one of the most significant pastoral psychologists of our day. He's the author of several important books on exactly this, how healing occurs through pastoral counseling in particular. And three of his offerings that I want to lift up for us. He has this wonderful phrase. He says that all of us live an implicit theological drama. Now, it's implicit because probably there are lots of days that go by where we do not say to ourselves, now, how did I act out of my theological convictions today? We might do an examine of consciousness or something, or an examination of conscience. Our spiritual practice might invite that. But there's a lot that occurs on any given day for us that's out of our awareness, and yet it's deeply theological. And often it's at times of crisis or loss that the theological drama gets a little more explicit. For instance, do we feel that we have been abandoned in our suffering by God? Many people do, at least initially. And then they may kind of live out of that. I've had conversations with some folks over the years who feel so abandoned by God that then they say something like, well, so now I'm ignoring God. If God's ignoring me, so I'm giving God the cold shoulder now. That's part of the implicit theological drama that gets a little clearer sometimes in times of crisis or loss. It's related to this second point, the operational versus professed theologies. Jordan, and others use this language as well, but Jordan helps us to draw a distinction between these two. They may be closely related, but they're not always. So our professed theology is that theology which we articulate and to which we give cognitive assent. Meaning, if I said to any one of you, tell me how you understand God's role in suffering, whatever it is you would say is part of your professed theology. It's what's consciously available to you and that you articulate and presumably you assent to. But of course we know not all of our theology operates on a conscious level. There's also what Jordan calls our operational theology. This is the theology that is sometimes out of awareness for us, and yet it has tremendous power in our lives. It shapes our worldview, how we see ourselves, how we understand reality, how we make meaning. For instance, I will share a story that years ago, I talked with a woman whose daughter had been diagnosed with breast cancer. And this was a big shock to the family. And the mother was a very devout, pious Catholic woman, and had really sort of dedicated her life to praying for her children and for their well-being. Well, then her daughter got diagnosed with breast cancer. So we were talking about the shock of it all, and she said to me, well, you know, I have sort of been slacking off in my prayer lately because all my children seem to be doing pretty well, and so I've gotten a little lazy. And so maybe one good thing that could come out of this is that I'll get back to praying. But, she said, isn't it too bad that my daughter had to pay the price? Now, do you hear what that is? That was her operational theology bubbling up, and she was shocked. As soon as it came out of her mouth, she was shocked. That was her operational theology bubbling up, that at least on some unconscious level that she might not even really have known about, there was a part of her that believed that God could punish someone with breast cancer because someone else wasn't praying enough. Now, when something bubbles up like that, you know, we may be, and probably many of us have had such moments, right, where all of a sudden we think, whoa, did I say that? Is that really part of my faith system, my belief? And so sometimes people want to kind of push it away or deny it, like, oh, no, I never said that. That was a total Freudian slip. Well, before we do that, we want to sort of let it breathe a little, because it's also an incredible opportunity. And this is sometimes what pastoral care provides, is the opportunity to look at those ways that one's operational theology and professed theology may be dissonant or discordant, and lift that up and say, well, what do we make of that? And who is the God in whom you do want to hope and trust? And so it can be an opportunity. It can be a wonderful opportunity, a painful one. And this last phrase that Merle Jordan offers us, the last bullet here, is that we may sometimes need to dethrone or de-absolutize idols. Sometimes what we discover as we grow up and work and become more self-aware or experience loss or struggle, sometimes we discover that we have made some things that are not God are gods. You know, for many people, the struggle with parental authority can last a lifetime. You know, sometimes as elderly folks, some people are more concerned still with what their parents would have thought than with what God thinks. You know, and that's not a blaming statement. Those early authority figures are just so important to us. Other things, for some people, work becomes an idol of sorts or a god. And of course we know anything that is not God is going to lead us astray, ultimately, if we make it our God. And so sometimes in crisis or loss, those false gods become clearer to us because they may fall away. They're not going to hold us anymore. And so it's an opportunity to clarify for ourselves who is God, who is our God. So that is the second perspective I'd like to propose on how pastoral care heals. And the third perspective is work that we're seeing done in a lot of fields now in narrative theology, narrative psychology, narrative therapy. Narrative, meaning story, is just huge now in a lot of different fields, and for good reason, because we know that we are people of stories. And Christianity is a religion of stories, in large part. If we think of just our own individual lives, we tend to think of our lives in terms of story. You know, for instance, if I sat down next to one of you, and we haven't met, and I said, tell me about yourself, what you would start to share would probably be, at least eventually, in the form of a story. It wouldn't just be name, rank, and serial number. You'd flesh it out. You'd tell me about yourself. You'd tell me where you grew up and what that was like. And then I'd probably ask you questions that invited more of the story. That's often how we interact, right? That's often what pastoral care asks. Tell me your story. How is your story of ending up here in this hospital or in this office? Stories are so significant in pastoral care because stories often contain and articulate the meaning of our lives. Now that's sort of a lofty kind of abstract thought, so let's break that down a little. You know, meaning, a very sort of colloquial way of saying what is meaning is, it's what gets us out of bed in the morning. Have you ever had those days where it's been really hard to get out of bed? And not because you're tired, but because maybe something about how you've put your life together or how things are changing just leaves you asking questions about the meaning of it all. Well, meanings and stories are intimately connected. You know, if I describe what is of most value to me, well, how did that become of most value to me? Often it's because of stories. Sometimes it's the family stories that were handed to me. You know, for instance, in my family growing up, Irish family, humor, huge value. People would compete at dinner who could be funnier. You know, that's a source of meaning for us. Education, for many of us, an important source of meaning. The work probably all of you do or hope to do is a source of meaning for you, and you might have learned it through family stories about what it means to be a Christian, or what it means to be a Catholic, or what it means to be a good person, or what it means to be working for God's reign. This gets communicated so often through stories. And then at a certain point, we start to create our own story. And that's more another source of our meaning. You know, like for many people, it's very important that my story include partnership in children or grandchildren or wonderful friends. It's part of the story. So what happens to all of us at one point or another is what in the grief literature we call narrative disruption. Sometimes the story is disrupted, or sometimes even destroyed. You know, for instance, when someone dies young, well, for many of us, that wasn't part of the story. You know, when people lose children or grandchildren, often what I hear is, that's not the way it's supposed to go. Children are not supposed to die before their parents. It's a disruption to the story. And when the story gets disrupted, the meaning may very well get disrupted. And so that's why, you know, meaning, another way of thinking about meaning is how we make sense of things. So have you noticed how often in a time of loss or a crisis, people will talk about, this just doesn't make any sense. This is senseless, right? We use that language a lot. That's going to the meaning of this. is just incomprehensible. And the meaning that's left is now in jeopardy. So the great challenge of loss, this is the words of Robert Niemeyer, who's a constructivist psychologist doing some of the best work in a contemporary understanding of grief right now. And he works out of a narrative perspective. And this is what he says. Like a novel that loses a central character in the middle chapters, the life story disrupted by loss must be reorganized, rewritten, to find a new strand of continuity that bridges the past with the future in an intelligible fashion. That's not easy. And this is, if you're doing pastoral care work, this is a lot of what you're doing with folks. This is one way of framing what you're doing, is helping people figure out how to rewrite the story. Because the future story that was imagined, perhaps, is just impossible now. You know, if someone always imagined, oh, you know, I'm going to work until I'm 70, that's when I'm going to retire, and that's when the good times will begin, and then they're struck with a terrible illness in their 50s and never got to have the good times. Well, that's a difficult future story to rewrite. So, how do we work in this area with folks? It's important to realize in the work that we do that very often in crisis or loss, it's the meanings that have to be healed. And very often those are theological meanings. Sometimes the theological meanings are harder to get to. For instance, how people feel about God's activity, God's role in all of this. You know, some people may say one thing, but it may not capture all of what they're thinking or feeling. And it may be sort of an initial, almost a defensive comment. To really unpack the theological meaning of an event for someone sometimes can take quite a long time. It takes quite a lot of compassion. And as we're doing this, again, it's the pastoral relationship that helps create the space, the time, the compassion for that to come to the surface. And if the meaning is no longer going to hold, sometimes the pastoral relationship provides the venue for reconstructing meaning. You know, for instance, if someone has hung their hat on, you know, I am of value because I work really hard and I support my family, and then they are unable to work for whatever reason, illness, or they're laid off, can't find a new job, well, there's a meaning that may have to get reconstructed. How are they going to understand, reinterpret their value? And I think we see a lot of that happening now for a lot of folks. I just heard today on the radio, we're still years away from job levels, job stability at pre-recession levels. We're years away, say some. So, you know, this is an example that's ripped from the headlines. Lots of folks are struggling with meaning in that way. But that's part of where the pastoral relationship is so helpful, because what we also know is that none of us creates meaning all by ourselves. Meanings are co-constructed. If you think about anything that's meaningful to you, if you think about what is most meaningful to you in your life, my guess is you could come up with a list of folks who've helped to shape that meaning. And it would probably be hard to come up with one that you could say, oh no, it was all me. I'm the only one who shaped that meaning. You know, because we take in influences, information everywhere, all the time. T.S. Eliot, the poet, said, we had the experience but missed the meaning. And that's true often. You know, we go through life, and unless others help us to say, now, whoa, what does this all mean? We can miss it. And we miss an opportunity to create a hopeful meaning. So this is a critical way that pastoral care can heal, helping people co-create meaning in a time of loss or struggle or crisis in ways that give hope. So to recap these three perspectives, I would propose that the goal of all of them is actually similar. Through pastoral relationship and connection with the faith community, we come to know more deeply and fully the love of God in Christ for each one of us. And ultimately, that is our greatest source of healing. God's love in Christ is what ultimately holds us in our brokenness. It is what is ultimately truthful, as opposed to sometimes our operational theology, and it is the source of ultimate meaning. So our relationship, which points always to relationship with God in Christ, underlies all of these perspectives as sources of healing. So let's return to our Band-Aid. So I want to propose that pastoral care heals in ways that might be somewhat different from the Band-Aid. Pastoral care heals not by simplistic reassurance, you're going to be just fine, not by making pain disappear, and not with that crazy exclamation point. You know, sometimes life is much heavier, sadder than that. How does pastoral care heal as opposed to the Band-Aid? Pastoral care helps us to think of healing in fuller, deeper ways. Healing does not mean that the pain is all gone, or one is going to be as good as new, or just fine. Healing, from a pastoral perspective, is not magic. Pastoral care acknowledges and stays with the pain and struggle, at least for a time. This is very important. Have you ever been rushed through your pain by someone else who may have meant really well? They just didn't want to see you suffering anymore, but they rushed you through your pain. And how helpful was that? For me, it's never helpful. I feel like, okay, either you don't have time for me, or you actually are not understanding what I'm saying to you. And neither one of those feels good. It's hard to believe that we're coming up on the 10th anniversary of 9/11, isn't it? For me, it's shocking that it's been almost 10 years. But I remember vividly going to a prayer service that night. And some of you may have had to preach that day or the next day. And who would have wanted that assignment? I sure would not have. And so I have nothing but sympathy for the person who I heard preach. But my struggle was with the passage he chose. He chose to preach on, "Let not your hearts be troubled." Now for me, that just totally missed where I was at. I mean, people were still desperately trying to find out if their loved ones were alive or what the heck was happening. And to invite us not to let our hearts be troubled just felt like a disconnect. Under terrible circumstances, I have nothing but sympathy for the fact that he had to come up with something that day. But it is so important when we're able to stay with the pain and acknowledge it, because that's where so much can be happening that we will then be working with. The narrative disruption, the experience of brokenness, the operational theology bubbling up in disturbing ways, etc. But we do more than just acknowledge and stay with the loss. We offer our relationship of care, but always pointing beyond ourselves. We are not the end goal of the pastoral relationship, as we know. We want always, like John the Baptist, to point to the one who truly saves. And this can be such a relief for us, right? If we felt like it was all up to us, holy moly. So it's a relief to realize, no, we always want to help people realize that their deepest connection needs to be with our God. And in the Christian community, our God knows brokenness. We will be walking that this coming week. Our God knows brokenness. And so our goal, our challenge, our mission is to embody and communicate God's love, which raised Christ from the dead, which knows our brokenness, and which is our hope in suffering. And it's our relationships with one another and with this God of love that hold us and heal us. We've never been promised that we will not suffer. We know that. But we have been assured that God has destined us in love, Ephesians, and that nothing will ever separate us from the love of God in Christ Jesus our Lord, Romans. Now, I will say, I fully understand that sometimes it's hard to communicate this to other folks, and sometimes, let's be honest, it can be hard to even take it in ourselves, depending on what life has thrown at us. It can be very hard to truly, 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 consistently, deep in our tissues, to believe that God is always compassionate love. And so at those times, or when others say to me, yeah, well, that's you. I know you believe that, or you try to believe it, but, I need more. I always try to point people to some of the spiritual teachers that I think help us to trust in the God of love. And for me, one of the most important people is Julian of Norwich. And we don't know a lot about Julian. We don't even know her real name. But we do know that she lived from 1342 to about 1416, and she was an anchoress in the Church of St. Julian in Norwich, England, and that she was devoted to a life of contemplation and prayer. And one day in 1373, when she was about 30, in one day, she experienced 16 visions, which in her day were called showings. And she was convinced that they were from God. And she spent years, she wrote them down immediately, and then she spent years and years figuring out what they had meant. She spent 20 years in contemplation and prayer, wondering what those showings had meant. And her conclusion, consistently, she wrote about it again 20 years later, her conclusion was, what they all meant was God is love. And the book she wrote is the first book written in English by a woman. And so I wanted to share this quote. This is part of what she wrote. And from the time that it was revealed, I desired many times to know in what was our Lord's meaning. And 15 years after and more, I was answered in spiritual understanding, and it was said, what? Do you wish to know your Lord's meaning in this thing? Know it well. Love was his meaning. Who reveals it to you? Love. What did he reveal to you? Love. Why does he reveal it to you? For love. Remain in this, and you will know more of the same, but you will never know different without end. Julian is also the person who gave us the gorgeous lines that so many people find comforting. All shall be well, and all shall be well, and all manner of things shall be well. Now, she didn't offer that in a simplistic way. Part of her showings were about sin, and she wrote a lot about sin, and she had a very sophisticated understanding of humankind's sinful nature. And yet, she was certain that love was God's meaning in every circumstance. She said, we are endlessly loved with an endless love. Boy, for someone who needed comfort, that's what more could you offer, really? Julian's conviction, we are endlessly loved with an endless love. I'd like to just offer a couple more slides that have to do with the pastoral caregiver. And I'll use the language of we for these. It is so important in this work. As we know, the potential for burnout or brownout, as some people call it, where you just really sort of start getting slow and, it gets harder and harder. The potential is huge. There are all kinds of statistics, folks right out of ministry programs, folks who've been in ministry for a long time. Lots of folks are burning out and leave, move on to other fields. And it's hard. It's hard, it's hard, it's hard. So one very important thing is I put see here in quotation marks, to see one's blind spots. I'm not sure we can see our blind spots, but that's where community can help us, and friends and family and colleagues and support groups. What is especially hard for us? What do we need to be mindful of? What are we not good at? Why set ourselves up for failure and frustration and burnout and anxiety and worry? What do we need to see about ourselves that would help us make good choices in terms of what sort of care we can offer? And related to that is knowing one's limits. We cannot do it all. Next week will be the 12th anniversary, I think, of the horrible tragedy at Columbine High School in Colorado. If you're from the U.S., you know what that was. 2 high school students opened fire on their classmates and killed many of them and killed a teacher. And I was out at Columbine a few years after that for a gathering of pastoral theologians. And we talked with some of the folks who had been sort of doing the immediate crisis response when that all started happening. And it was chaos, of course. But here's what I wanted to share with you. There was a local minister there who was one of the first responders because he was in a staff meeting with his parish staff, and someone called him and said, there's shooting going on at the high school. So he grabbed his staff, he said, everyone in my truck, and he took off. He's the one that told us the story. He took off, and as they were driving through, the campus, he would sort of toss them off the truck and say, you, go over there, you, over there. And of course, I almost, my heart stopped imagining myself being in the back of that truck. I'm not sure how well I could have done. But then he said, a lot of the students and teachers, they had to get out of the high school, of course, and so they went to the local library. And that's where he went. And he started calling some of the other area ministers to say, we're at the library, come on down, we need help. And some of the other ministers said things like, well, I'm in the middle of a Bible study, but I'll come as soon as I can. Now, when he told us that story, I had the very same reaction that some of you just had. I sort of gasped, what? What poor pastoral caregivers. How could they be so, stupid or selfish or uncompassionate or something? But, after I thought about that for a while, I actually had a different response, which was, we don't know the history of those folks. Some of them may have had a trauma history. And folks who have been exposed to a lot of trauma in their lives, or high stress, or really painful losses, sometimes they cannot be first responders. They cannot and they should not. It's not their gift. It can be re-traumatizing. And nobody benefits from anyone being traumatized. It's not noble to be re-traumatized. It's not more noble than to say, I just can't. There was plenty of work to do after the fact. So I share that with you as just a reminder that pastoral care is not one size fits all. We do have to know our limits. We do have to know our blind spots and our histories. And we need to care for ourselves, of course. And we need to be part of networks of care. Jean Stevenson Musner, who gave us that nice definition of pastoral care at the beginning, she also does a nice piece in one of her writings on the Good Samaritan, the parable of the Good Samaritan. And she points out that the Good Samaritan relied on a network of care to care for the wounded person, as symbolized by the innkeeper. And the Samaritan continued his journey. We too need networks of care. We cannot be all things to all people. You know, there are ways that we have to continue our journeys too, and we need to trust and invite others to be part of the response, part of the care. It cannot, must not, should not, need not be all up to us. There's a very common phrase used in all kinds of therapy and psychology and counseling circles that the best thing to do, and pastoral care talks about this too, is to be a non-anxious presence. Are we familiar with that phrase? I'm not sure I know anyone who's ever been a total, because sometimes people are anxious. Am I being non-anxious? Or am I communicating anxiety? You know, it kind of stresses people out. But what I want to propose is, you know, we also want to be in touch with our own anxiety, if there is any, about ourselves, about our lives, and about our relationship with God. How can we feel more trusting, hopeful, confident, secure in God's cherishing love for us? So I share this beautiful passage with you. I think if we prayed this all once a day, we'd perhaps all be floating on cloud 9. These are the words of a spiritual director in France in the 19th century, Abbé Henri de Tourville. And he says this, and the words I think are quite resonant with Julian of Norwich. Accustom yourself to the wonderful thought that God loves you with a tenderness, a generosity, and an intimacy which surpasses all your dreams. Give yourself up with joy to a loving confidence in God, and have courage to believe firmly that God's action toward you is a masterpiece of partiality and love. Rest tranquilly in this abiding conviction. And I would conclude by saying, when we do come to know more fully and feel God's tender love in Christ, we know that despite the loss and pain and suffering we'll all experience, in the deepest possible sense, all shall be well, and all shall be well, and all manner of things shall be well. Thank you very much. I'm going to go back to that slide. Some of you were writing that down, right? There you go. We have time for a few comments or thoughts or questions. And we have a microphone. If you do have anything you'd like to offer, we ask you to speak into the microphone. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Yes, way in the back. Can you use the microphone? Thank you.
Just grateful that you brought in so much scripture and so much of the necessary suffering involved in pastoral care. Thank you very much. It was beautiful.
Oh, thank you very much. We appreciate that. Who has a question or a thought to add? Yes.
Thanks very much for your presentation. Just had a question, seeking advice. I am a volunteer assistant chaplain in a hospital. I've had more than one occasion where either a patient or a family member is overcome by anger and resentment, almost to the point of hostility.
Yeah.
Wondering if there's a certain technique or certain passages that you could recommend in circumstances like that.
Can you say more about the anger? They're angry at God or life?
Angry at God, or just angry about their circumstance.
Yeah.
A situation comes to mind with a young family member whose parent was dying a very difficult death. That individual, the young son, did not believe in God, but was still very angry and wanted to express it, but didn't know who to express it at because he didn't believe in God, so who else was he going to be angry and upset with?
Yeah, that makes it even more complex for some folks. Yeah, I'm sure a lot of you have wonderful ideas that you would draw on in those moments. Maybe you want to share with one another. I can share just a couple of thoughts. I think it's important, first, as we said before, to give people permission to experience the range of feelings and to point out that our God, fully human, fully divine, understands, knows every one of those feelings. So the anger is not a surprise or a shock to God. God is not offended by it. We see examples of Jesus' anger in some of the Gospels. So I think, we want to draw on those things. But then I think when we sense any of the openness, we want to help, if people would like our help, we want to help people to somehow understand that, yes, this horrible thing has happened, and the old story is gone, and we are outraged by that. And it's not fair, and it's not right. How, though, will we create a new story that offers us something? And that may feel like slim pickings to people for quite a long time, or like poor consolation. But as folks are open and trusting, we try to draw on passages like Revelations, making all things new. Or Andrew Lester is a pastoral theologian who talks about God is always out in front of us, calling us into an open-ended future. We don't know the future, and we can be outraged that the future we wanted has been ripped away from us. But somehow, eventually, slowly, we have to try to construct a new story, because otherwise, what's our choice? But I think those are some of the most difficult moments. And maybe some of you have thoughts you'd like to add, how you've managed these situations. Yes, would you like to respond? Okay, here's the microphone.
When I've had a patient or a family member...
Is the microphone on?
When I've had a patient or a family member who's been so angry, either there isn't a God or how did God do this, I try to make sure I always go back to God didn't do it and is probably crying too, to really connect with the incarnate God. That seems to have, for me, I try to quote scripture at that point for people has made them angrier. I learned that pretty quickly. But that sense that it's all of our choices and things in our environment and that whole sense of free choice, that in the long run people have come back and said, so maybe God exists? And it's okay for them to still have the question.
Yes.
And not try to answer it.
That's right, because how can we answer it? Yeah. Thank you for that. I'm just remembering another sort of technique that some people find helpful is sort of a guided imagery that, if you were to ask such a person who's just maybe consumed with rage, where they see themselves in relationship to God, and perhaps I don't believe in God, so I'm not in relationship at all, but sometimes it's surprising. Sometimes people who are incredibly enraged would say, when asked to sort of image it, would say, well, God's right here, and once I work through my anger, we'll be all right. You don't know what the anger, everybody's anger is different, and what can be part of the anger is different too. So sometimes inviting people to image it, and then also to image it in the future. Andrew Lester and I think it's Howard Stone also have done work on what they call future stories. That the tendency in pastoral care, or I should say the tendency in pastoral counseling, is very often to focus on the present as it relates to the past. And that's usually what therapy does as well. What we tend to neglect is the future, which is really problematic when you think about it, because that's where we're all headed. So they do this whole piece on future stories. If you could invite someone, imagine where you are in 5 years. And how are you with your anger in 5 years? And some people will reject that, like, what do you mean? I'm going to be just as angry. Well, okay, let's just try to pin that down. You know, you're going to be so many years old. Maybe you're going to be in college. Maybe you're going to have children. Maybe you're going to be a grandparent. 5 years from now, let's try to get concrete. What has happened to your anger? Now, this is purely imaginative, but some people can work with that and can say, well, I'm not so angry anymore. I've made peace with my anger. And then you say, well, how did you get there? And not everyone can do this, but some people can. They'll get into it like, all right, well, I think I took a break from religion for a while. Or I just wanted nothing to do with God for a while. But then slowly I realized that I'm not the only one who's ever had horrible things happen. And I don't want to be alone in this anymore, etc. I'm making this up. But, you know, some people can actually start to create their own timeline, their own sequence of events to get where they can imagine themselves being. So that may be helpful for some folks too. Yes, way in the back. We'll take just a couple more. I promise I'll wrap up in a few minutes.
I read once the biography of Princess Diana. So this made me think of it. So when she died, it was early morning.
Yes.
And when they knew about it in the palace, the queen didn't want the children to know. One was 13 and the other one was 9. And so Prince Charles went to France. Meanwhile, when the children woke up, the grandmother,
The queen.
the queen went to tell them, your mother died. Now, remember, you are royals.
Oh.
No tears.
Oh.
No grief.
Oh.
No grieving. Instead, she sent them all day hiking in Scotland, all day. And when they came the next day, she was pleased. She didn't know they cried or not. Then she said to them, now you may enjoy when people are going to drop all the flower in front of the palace, you may enjoy the note, and while reading what people were putting for your mom, then you can try to heal yourself. And be graceful to people, but remember, no tears.
Oh, my.
How do you explain this?
Yeah, well, there are so many different cultural expectations about grief, what grieving is supposed to look like. And royalty perhaps is its own culture. I guess it is. So yeah, this is just a bit of an aside about grief. We do know that not everyone experiences grief primarily in an emotional way, that for some it is primarily emotional, and so tears might be incredibly important and inevitable. For some people, their primary experience of grief is more cognitive. And so sometimes we see folks not crying, and we may judge that, right? Like, oh, I guess she didn't really care. And there could be a lot of things going on. But we would want people to have the freedom to grieve in whatever way they need to. Thank you. How about, yes, can you wait for the microphone?
I wanted to return just for a minute to the angry man who didn't believe in God. And I'm thinking more in a hospital context than in an extended pastoral care context. And what I'm thinking about is, so few people are comfortable with another person's anger, or their own for that matter, that I think being able to hold the man's anger and to allow him to be angry and experience his anger, even though there is no one for him in his mind to be angry at, is probably really important. In other words, to him, it would be irrational to be angry. But clearly that was something that he needed to experience. And particularly in a situation where you're not going to be seeing someone, you know, on an ongoing basis.
Right.
I just, maybe elementary, but I feel as though it's important to, it's just important to say that anger and sorrow and tears are so closely related. It's entirely likely that the anger is something that he needed to express in order to reach his sorrow. So I hope that might be helpful.
That's well said. Thank you. And how about one more over here?
When you had mentioned about getting into the work mode and forgetting a lot of the things that we do, we just function into a role. As pastoral caregivers, I was made aware of that in my ministry very early on, to be very careful of not falling into the trap. For the past 10 years, with the victims of child abuse, I've dealt with that a great deal, and because of that notoriety, I've come to deal with children and their early demise because of taking their own lives as well. And after a while, it can get to you.
Right.
And I was functioning in that work mode. I've got to do, I've got to do, I've got to do it. I can't let go of this. And in the past couple of years, I've realized that I needed to heal myself in that pastoral care way, because how can I tell someone that God loves them and I don't love myself enough to do something about that caring and to replenish that grace, that love that God has given me in my life? So one of the things that I have found is that I try once a month to go up to Weston Priory, to the Benedictine monks up there.
Lovely.
And it's just a day, it's an overnight, it's getting up at 4 a.m., going to the services all day, and coming back. But it's connecting back to my God, who has given me that strength to share and to be pastoral to others.
Yeah.
So we really need to be cognitive of the fact that we need to care for ourselves first before we can do much for others.
That's right.
And it's not a selfish thing, it is a necessary thing.
It's a survival thing. Thank you very much for that. That's a wonderful note to end on. I wish you all healing and self-care and a lovely Holy Week and a joyous Easter. Thank you for coming.
Thanks very much, Melissa, for all these, all that we have to ponder and these rich perspectives on pastoral care. And thanks to all of you for coming. If you didn't get this handout at the table, there are more there. These are our summer events that are coming up. Colleen Griffith will present the Underhill Lecture on Practical Mysticism. These are all in July. The Shanleys will offer a workshop on living an integrated life of nonviolence and sustainability. And our third annual Mary of Magdala Day celebration will have a lecture by Carolyn Osiek. So I hope we'll see you this summer at some of our events.